Hi, my name is Nicki Kons, and I wanted to share a lecture with you that I prepared for the Israeli National Knowledge Center for Emergency Readiness. I was asked to do this lecture actually 2 to 3 months ago when we first started discussing this, and little did we know how relevant it's going to be with the current corona crisis. So after giving the lecture yesterday, I decided it might be a good idea for other participants from different parts of the world to listen in and participate as well. Well, not participate, but kind of listen in. So let's get started. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with risk management. I'm just gonna read out the basic definition, but risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more objectives. Positive risks are opportunities, while negative risks are threats. But I'm not going to elaborate a lot on the whole subject of risk management. I will assume that most of you know the processes. So the thing about risk management, it's kind of tricky. There are processes, there's data, and there's the people skills and people biases. And the sweet spot of success is kind of an intersection of all of that. Because we're talking about something that hasn't happened yet, risk is trying to have a crystal ball and look into the future. It's kind of tricky. So what I do is a lot of people ask me, how come you also do processes and data and all, and a little bit of psychology? Well, the reason for that is that I believe that there's progress in each of these areas and disciplines. And what I do is I take the best practices and progress, and now we have a lot going on the data front. Um, so I take whatever is available, and that always keeps us getting better and better and better at risk management. That's really important for extreme cases. So I'm going to state a claim to kind of get us all aligned. And I'm going to state that the world has become risk averse since World War II. So what you're seeing here is a graph that shows battle-related deaths. And you can see it going down. But if I was to show any other graph in other areas, you would see similar phenomena. So the world is becoming risk averse, and we have to take it into consideration when we're doing a risk assessment for extreme conditions and situations. What I'm going to do is I'm not gonna do a very a methodological review of risk. I'm just gonna choose phenomena that I find um, that are super relevant for extreme conditions. Um, Two of them are gonna be more data oriented, with non-linear patterns, and I'm gonna ask the question, does probability matter in extreme cases? Then we're gonna move on to biases and personal skills, and then we are gonna focus on emerging risks and wrong and right way risks, and then talk about the system approach to risk. And we're going to discuss antifragility and strategic dominance. The thing about linear and nonlinear behaviors, the way we kind of tend to look at it is, let's say I'm taking a test, and I know I'm going to score somewhere between 0 to 100. Now that's not a very interesting case, right? Because while I don't like to fail, it's still very predictable in a way. What really is interesting to us in end cases and extreme conditions are exponential growth. That's one thing. And what we call as tails of the distribution. And those tails, they can be very narrow, but theoretically, they go from negative infinity to infinity. So that's the distributions we tend to care about more in end cases. Now let's look at some data from the corona virus distribution. That's exactly it, right? If you take a look at the graph on the left with the total cases, you see an exponential growth. And what you'll see on the graph at the bottom of the screen with the purple is what the healthcare providers are scared of is that they don't know the max number of the purple graph. They know the max of the graph with the lines going through it. So that's what they're talking about, the curve all the time, trying to get the curve to their max availability of um, of ventilators. So that's really the coronavirus is a really good test case for that. Now, what you'll see on the graph on the upper part of the screen with the growth factor um, is a really bad graph because what you see is an outlier on February, I think it's 11th or somewhere along that time, that is not really helping us in analyze this graph because it should have been excluded just because we can't analyze anything because of that um, peak in the graph. So moving on to after we kind of understood that the type of probabilities that are interesting to us, let's talk about probabilities. And this is I would call it the common matrix we have for probability and impact for risk. We have the threats and opportunities, and they're different types of matrices, but basically this is the basic thing. And we use it to show where the different risks are and how many risks we have in the focus area and how many risks we have out of the focus area. This is the basic graph, the representation on a graph that we use. Let's take wars, for example. Let's try thinking about wars in the context of probabilities. So usually a risk score is impact times probability. Let's say we are trying to assess the risk for an all-out nuclear war scenario, and we'll use PN as the probability of a war happening in 1 year. And in 50 years, you can see the calculation of how to calculate the probability of having that a war will happen in one of those 50 years. So even if we let PN equals 0.01%, over 50 years, the probability of having an all-out nuclear war is 5%. So what I'm trying to explain here, that when you say probability, you kind of have to narrow down what you're talking about. Is it a probability for just 1 year? Is it for 50 years? What exactly are you looking for? Because there is a difference between 0.01% and a 5%, of course. Another example would be if we assume that PA is the probability of a multi-casualty war in the Middle East in a given year, then of course it's way larger than an all-out nuclear war, right? PA is so much greater than PN. But still, if you're an analyst for the UN, if you're trying to assess global you're trying to assess the global threats, then there is validity in PA times impact A, which is way less than Pn times impact N. So what I'm trying to prove here to you is that probability does matter, but sophisticated risk analysis, especially for extreme conditions, you have to walk through all the different types of calculations and trying to figure it out. Let's take another example of climate change. Now, not getting into the different scenarios of what those two different scenarios are, you see two different graphs with a threshold of about 3.7 degree raise in temperature as the disaster criteria. And you can see the different scenarios. So sensitivity analysis also is it's really important, because there's a huge difference if you're referring to the 10th percentile climate sensitivity scenario, which we seem to be fine with in both cases, in both these graphs, or if you're referring to the 90th percentile climate or the 50th. So it's really important to understand which scenario you're referring to. So in that case, I would say probability definitely matters. So moving away from data to biases and to people. Basically, these types of biases are in every decision we make, everything we do, and definitely in assessing risks. So we're going to focus on one example and see how during risk assessment all these biases come to play, especially in extreme conditions. I don't know if you know the case of the Flint River in Michigan case. I'm just going to walk you through this example just so we can understand the dynamics and the biases that went on, the pre-crisis, during crisis, and after crisis. I have an article that I published about that a few years back. So what happened in Flint was Flint basically could not pay for the water it was getting from it's Flint, Michigan. So it was getting water from Detroit. It couldn't make the payments. Flint didn't have the money. So there was a plan. There was a plan to disconnect Flint from that water system and hook it up to another. They kind of decided they were going to hook it up to an existing infrastructure to the Flint River and Haroon Lake, and there was infrastructure needed a little bit of work, but all in all, it seemed like a very good idea to save money, and they went through with it. And all of a sudden, they're having the people of Flint drink water with lead. So not a pretty situation, and it took them a few years to take care of this situation. So definitely a significant crisis and an extreme case. So pre-crisis, let's look at the biases. So there's a plan, that there's another infrastructure, the lure of choice, and lack of empathy. They can't pay, so we're upset about that, and well, we're optimistic we'll make it happen. How hard could it be to connect a very short line or to the Flint River, and so it should be fine. Anyway, during the crises, things are a little bit different, but you would think that manageability confirmation map would not come to play, but it definitely did. It took them a lot of years to actually admit they were doing something wrong. They kept on insisting, well, we did what we were supposed to do, on the government side. And fatalistic bias, it seemed like, wow, this could never be solved. Come on. There are more difficult situations than that. So So being fatalistic about it doesn't seem very logical. Um, After the crisis, basically everything that happens refers to Flint. So a lot of the government issued, regulation is a lot of, hindsight. People think it's an illusion of control. So these all come to play. Um, I want to discuss feelings a little bit because we never think of feelings when we're doing, we always think we're very analytical doing risk management plans and during a crises, and but we are biased to our feelings. And it's just an example of how fear, hate, and joy come to play. And you have to consider it when you're assessing risk or when you're thinking about other people assessing risk. So moving on to the next example with Fukushima, nuclear. I hope you know this example, but what happened here was a nuclear reactor near the ocean in Japan. So let's look at the concept of emerging risk. So emerging risk is when we start out, when we assess there's one risk that when it happens, when it materializes, then there's a lot of other risks we didn't really, we either thought of, but not in a way that they actually happen or we didn't think about. So, in of course, Fukushima knew they were near the ocean and there are tsunamis, so they considered this risk. Definitely they did. So everything pretty much worked at the beginning as it should have with a reactor shutdown. However, they did not assess the risk of, or we don't know that they assessed the risk of having a grid shutdown, a grid problem is that the tsunami caused that was not related to the reactor, and that caused a few problems. And even things they did think about, like water flooding and all the radiation risk and public safety, if you refer back to the example we did with the climate change, the scenarios they were working on were not the ones that happened. They happened differently. So the best image I would use for emerging risk is just like mushrooms after the rain. They just pop, they just appear. And coronavirus, I'm always giving this example right now because it's on everybody's mind. Um, so of course, a pandemic is not a scenario that was not thought of, right? The whole there's Ebola, there's the there's lots of other diseases. So of course it was thought of. So, how do you get from a bat soup to worrying about how your healthcare systems break down? That's quite a reach, but though that's a perfect example of emerging risks. As I said, I'm jumping from one thing to the other just to give you a little taste of risk management in extreme conditions, because that's what it is. It's extreme in itself. So right way and wrong way risks are from finance actually, and it's a correlation between different things. So we love it when we have a right way risk, and we don't like it when we have a wrong way risk. A right way risk right now with the corona is supermarkets and being in the supermarket business and being in the toilet paper manufacturer during the outbreak, right? They're exactly negatively correlated uh, to this pandemic. It would also be owning an airline, and if you're an oil production company, because then if oil prices fall short, then your airline is making more money, and so on. So you like right way risks, and you don't like wrong way risks, like right now needing medical supplies when everybody else needs them. So good luck with that. And other examples we could see in gas storage caves and earthquakes, which are also correlated. So we don't like things that impact one another in bad way. And so those, everything I've been talking about until now um, was not always on the system level. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a system. What we've seen until now, and I hope you got that from what I've been doing up to this point in the presentation, is that even if we try to assess everything, we can't. We really can't assess everything. We don't have. We really kind of have to accept that. But Nassim Taleb is introduced the concept of anti-fragility. So what this concept is we can't identify 100% of the risks, but we have to be ready for unknowns and be able to take a hit. So let's look at this system. I'm not claiming this system is anti-fragile. I really am not claiming that. But this system has components that some are neutral to the hit, some get stronger, and some get weaker. So, for example, um, if uh, if whatever gets weaker breaks the system, it's not worth anything, right? It's a problem. Uh, let's take the health system right now. If other system cannot compensate for what's going on right now with the healthcare systems, then there is a problem. This January, Nassim Taleb, Joseph Norman, and Yaniv Bar-Yam published a very good article, and they referred to it that a system should be built such that ruin will not be in the system level, just in the component level. That's really important to try to make it happen and understand. So a few examples so we kind of get what we're talking about. For the space shuttle, if you have an O-ring that that's the weak part of the system and the system explodes, then you're not anti-fragile. That's one element. What's going to be very interesting right now is I'm asking, are you as weak as the weakest link? And I think the example of the US is very interesting to look at right now with the coronavirus, because you have the US coastal states, you have the East Coast and you have the West Coast, and you have all the states in between in Middle America. They're usually I believe they're right way risk correlated. So I believe it's going to be very interesting to see as a system how the whole system plays out, and I do think it's going to be anti-fragile, but that's my guess right now. So one of the things is your weakness, your strength. For example, young population. If your population is young right now, then maybe you're less exposed to fatalities in the coronavirus right now. And last but not least, can you recover? Anti-fragile systems, they have to be able to recover. So are you able to take a hit? That's really important. And how can you survive? How will you survive? That's a question you should be asking yourself right now. The one last item I will cover in this presentation is strategic dominance. Strategic dominance is basically saying, no matter what would have happened, I would have chosen this solution. So if you take a look at this example, if you have a threat, let's say it's flu, anthrax, or unknown, if your objectives you're trying to protect are either medical teams exposure or general public exposure, those are your objectives, So what kind of dominant strategy do you have? Types of level of stocks and supplies and so on. That's a very, very important analysis to make. So to summarize it all, risk management for extreme situations is unique and does require thinking out of the box and thinking at things in a different way from a lot of different perspectives. And you have to use your data, your processes, your people skills, know your biases, and do opportunities management. We haven't covered it today, but it's really crucial. And wow, we risk managers don't really have an exciting job. I know sometimes we're just considered, people who fill out templates and Excels, but well, not really. So we do have an exciting job. So please feel free to reach out to me. And in any question you might have. And thank you again for the Israeli National Knowledge Center for Emergency Readiness for making this lecture possible. And please feel free to share your thoughts, not just about what I shared with you, but any thoughts you might have on this matter and the specific crises we're facing. Thank you.